All right. Well, again, welcome to the final GEMMS virtual lecture. Today we are going to hear from Arnold Hunt, and I think we're all looking forward to that. Before I introduce him, I'm just going to say a little bit about GEMMS, just in case anyone isn't all that familiar. GEMMS is the gateway to early modern manuscript sermons, and it's a bibliographic database of sermon manuscripts. Right now we have data from over 80 repositories located in the UK and primarily in the UK and North America. And we have almost 28,000 records for sermons in the database. And I don't think I said the dates either. And the manuscripts span the dates from 1530 to 1750. I am Jennifer Farouk. I'm the research associate for GEMMS, and I'll be chairing the session today. It's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Arnold Hunt. Well, I'm sure many of you already know him, but I'll do his introduction. He's recently joined the Durham University as a lecturer in early modern paleography. He specializes in early modern British religious and cultural history and has a particular interest in manuscript and print culture, as reflected in his talk today. He is the author of The Art of Hearing, English Preachers and Their Audiences 1590 to 1640, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. And his book won the Royal Historical Society Whitfield Book Prize. He is currently editing the 9th volume of the Oxford edition of the Sermons of John Donne, which is the parochial sermons, which will be published by, of course, by Oxford University Press. And today, Arnold is going to be speaking about, his title is From Manuscript to Print, the Commonplacing of Printed Sermons. And I'll hand things over to you, Arnold.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me just try and share my screen. I hope that works. Okay. Well, thank you very much to Jean Shavey and Jennifer Farouk for inviting me to take part in this seminar series, and thank you all very much for coming along. The subject of my paper today is the commonplacing of printed sermons, or as we might say today, the cut and pasting of printed sermons, their repurposing and reuse in commonplace books. There's been quite a lot of work on the way that sermons travelled from manuscript to print, but in this paper I want to reverse the direction of travel and look at the way that sermons travelled from print to manuscripts, which is in a sense the opposite direction to what we might expect. A very simple model of textual transmission would suggest that sermons, like other kinds of texts, have their origins in an authorial manuscript, which serves first as the base text for the oral sermon as delivered in preaching, and then as the copy text for a subsequent printed edition. In this model, the manuscript is primary, and the job of the editor is to try and get back as close as possible to the manuscript, which is to say, as close as possible to the author's original intention. But as most of you probably already know, sermons don't always follow this neat and tidy pattern. In many cases, the preacher would have started by making brief notes or a rough outline, which would then have served as the basis for the sermon as preached. The full manuscript would only have been written up, if at all, after the sermon had been delivered, possibly incorporating revisions and afterthoughts that never appeared in the oral version. That oral version, meanwhile, might have been noted down by members of the audience, whose notes might then have been used to create a printed edition. Any printed text, whether based on the preacher's manuscript or on hearers' notes, might then have been recopied into a commonplace book, which in turn might have been used by other preachers as a quarry for material to use in their own sermons. In short, sermons were fluid and adaptable texts which travelled back and forth between manuscript, print, and the spoken word. Now, I don't think that invalidates the concept of authorial intention. And in the case of Donne or Andrewes, for example, it seems to me entirely worthwhile to use the evidence of surviving manuscript sources to try and reconstruct an authorial text. But we also need to accept that early modern sermons are social texts. And a lot of what makes them interesting, at least to me, comes from the way they were adapted and appropriated and sometimes distorted in the course of transmission. And that brings me to commonplacing. A lot has been written about the culture of commonplacing in early modern Europe, and many of you will probably be familiar with this body of scholarship. So I'll only summarize the main points here. But briefly, commonplacing was a universal and ubiquitous method for processing texts and ideas in the early modern period. Its essence was the organization of material under loci or place headings for easy storage and retrieval. Typically, these place headings took the form of subject categories like God or church, mercy or goodness, or what have you, which functioned as mental and textual pigeonholes into which material could be filed. So, to take a very simple example, a member of the audience at the Globe Theatre in 1599, hearing Portia's speech on the quality of mercy in The Merchant of Venice, might have filed this away in a commonplace book under the heading Mercy, which might then come in handy if they were, say, a lawyer in court pleading for mercy for their client, or indeed a preacher expatiating on the theme of mercy from the pulpit. The use of material in this way was a key part of early modern rhetoric, part of a technique known as copia or abundance, in which the aim was to have stock of ideas that could be used to embellish and amplify speech and writing. It was a key part of the early modern art of memory, and it was a key part of what it meant to be a critically aware listener or reader. It was, in the common comparison, like being a bee, flying from flower to flower and collecting the nectar to take back to the hive and process into honey. Just as we have to imagine early modern audiences applying this technique when they sat in church listening to sermons or in the theatre watching plays, so too we have to imagine early modern readers applying it to printed books. And the material evidence for this is preserved in the many hundreds of surviving commonplace books, which provide invaluable evidence of early modern reading practices. All this is, of course, very well known and will be very familiar to those of you who've read Grafton and Jardine and Sherman and many others on the history of early modern reading. What is not quite so well studied, perhaps, is the way this applies to sermons. It hardly comes as a surprise to find early modern readers copying out extracts from printed sermons into their commonplace books, just as they copied out other printed texts. But this aspect of commonplacing has tended to fall between the cracks. Those who are interested in sermon manuscripts, including myself, have tended to concentrate on hearer's notes that can give us an insight into the sermon as preached. Those who are interested in commonplace books, meanwhile, have tended to concentrate on poetry, plays, and other literary texts. The commonplacing of printed sermons has not received the same level of attention. And this is compounded by the way this material has tended to be catalogued in libraries and archives, where it will often simply be described as religious or theological commonplace book with no mention of sermons, which means that it won't necessarily show up in the GEMMS database. In saying that, of course, I don't mean to sort of cast any shade on the wonderfully useful GEMMS database, but simply to stress that there is a lot of this material out there and it's not very well catalogued. For the purpose of this paper, I put together a provisional list of pre-1650 manuscripts containing extracts from printed sermons. This makes no pretensions to completeness. I'm absolutely certain there are many more such manuscripts left to find, and I hope very much that some of you will be able to draw my attention to examples that I've missed. Nonetheless, complete or not, I think it's a useful starting point in thinking about this material as a distinctive genre. I've spread this list over four slides on the PowerPoint. I won't talk you through it now, but as I gather this talk is being recorded, it'll be there for you to return to for reference if you want to. One thing that stands out at once is that with one exception, there's nothing on the list before 1600, which is perhaps not surprising, given that the publication of single printed sermons only really takes off after about 1590. Robert Burton famously jokes about this explosion of printed sermons in The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621. So many sermons, he says, that whole teams of oxen cannot draw them. A sermon at Paul's Cross, a sermon at St Mary's Oxon, a sermon at Christ Church, a sermon before the Right Honourable, Right Reverend, Right Worshipful, a sermon in English, in Latin, a sermon with a name, a sermon without, a sermon, etc. And these commonplaces books can be seen as an attempt to organise this rapidly expanding body of material and bring it under control. So just to run quickly through the list. And some of these I'll return to a bit later on in this talk. As you can see, just that nothing before 1600 apart from that one manuscript, and then then from the 1620s onwards, a big growth in the number that I found. Let me start with that one exception, the one 16th century manuscript on the list. This is Bodleian MS Eng C3400, a small notebook consisting of just 13 pages, entitled Apt and Fit Similes, taken out of learned men's sermons in Oxford, 1590, begun the 22nd of April. It suggested in the Bodleian catalogue that this may be connected to Robert Corddry's treasury or storehouse of similes from 1600, which takes a similar form. This is a printed commonplace book containing similes that were either taken from sermons or designed for use in sermons, arranged under place headings and with an index at the end for easy reference. Corddry's instructions to the reader are that this is to be used in conjunction with the hearing of sermons. He tells the reader that after his return home from the hearing of any godly lecture or sermon, where he hath either heard any principle of religion handled and spoken of, or else any virtue commended or vice condemned, he should look up that point in the index and then read all such similes in the book as he shall there find touching the same point and matter. So the idea is that you start off with hearing the sermon, and then this collection of similes allows you to expand on the points that you've heard. The book was used by some contemporary readers as the basis for commonplace books of their own. The auction catalogue of the Puritan preacher William Whately, sold in 1683, includes a copy expanded into 2 volumes with blank interleaving and notes. I'd love to know if that copy survives, and if so, where it is now. It's not clear to me that there is any direct link between Corddry's book and the Bodleian manuscript. They simply illustrate the same method of hearing or reading sermons, where the object is to pull out vivid or unusual similes for copying into a commonplace book. The Bodleian manuscript consists mainly of notes taken from oral sermons, but it also includes notes on one printed sermon. Leonard writes A Summons for Sleepers from 1589, and here you can see the method in operation with a note on usurers. An old dog and a hungry flea are said to bite sore, but the covetous usurer biteth sorer. He that is once catched in the usurer's bands is much like a bird snared in a lime bush. The more she wrastles, the faster she is. And one more example, this time under the heading, Good life profiteth much. A teacher without virtue is compared to a painted fire without heat, or a fair visor put on a deformed face, or to the shipwrights that made Noah's ark, but perished themselves. I now want to take another manuscript, this one from about 30 years later, that shows the same method of sermon commonplacing, but in a more fully developed form. National Library of Scotland MS 2783 is a commonplace book of roughly 200 pages, which can be dated to the mid-1620s. It's arranged alphabetically under subject headings, beginning with afflictions, affections, antichrist, body, bishops, beauty, and baptism, and contains extracts from a range of printed sermons and other works, including Thomas Adams's England's Sickness, Timothy Bright's Treatise of Melancholy, Stephen Denison's Doctrine of the Sacraments, Theophilus Field's Christian Preparation to the Worthy Receiving of the Lord's Supper, Joseph Hall's Righteous Mammon, Nehemiah Rogers's The True Convert, and John White's Way to the True Church. In other words, a fairly typical cross-section of Jacobean printed divinity. Here are some samples of the contents. First, an extract from the sermons of John Boyes, Dean of Canterbury, a source that the compiler used so frequently that he abbreviated it simply to B. Above, you have the printed source from Boyes' exposition of the Dominical epistles and gospels, and below it you have the extract in the Commonplace book under the heading Humility. It is worthily noted that ambition is charity's ape, for as love giveth alms to the poor, so pride bribes the rich. As love is patient for eternal things, so pride is patient for earthly things. And another example, this time from a less well-known source, Giles Fletcher's sermon collection, The Reward of the Faithful, from 1623. A man may have riches, but riches must not have the man. As Aristippus said of Laius the harlot, exo lida, al ur exomai, that is, I possess her, but she does not possess me. From these examples, it's fairly clear what the compiler was looking for in printed sermons: short, moral commonplaces, freestanding, capable of being lifted out of their original context and characterized by rhetorical parallelism or chiasmus to make them easily memorable. We can expand on this analysis by looking at the passages that the compiler chose to extract from one particular sermon, John Donne's sermon on Acts chapter 1, verse 8, preached to the Virginia Company and published in 1624. And the compiler took 4 passages out of this sermon. The first was entered under the heading Prayer and draws a distinction between the 3 kingdoms of God, which Donne maps onto the 3 persons of the Trinity. God, as he is 3 persons, hath 3 kingdoms. The second passage was entered under the heading Resurrection and makes the point that we shall all be equal on the day of judgment. The angel that shall call us out of that dust will not stand to survey who lies naked, who in a coffin, who in wood, who in lead, who in a fine, who in a coarser sheet. The third passage was entered under the heading Day of Judgment and argues that Christ's promise, I am with you to the end of the world, was addressed not to the apostles alone, but to the whole succession of apostolic men. And the final passage was entered at the end of the Commonplace book without a subject heading and consists of a single sentence: this island, which is but the suburbs of the old world, is now become bridge, a gallery to the new. So here we have a small but significant piece of evidence to show how one contemporary reader responded to Donne's sermon. And clearly, if we can find enough material of the sort, we can start drawing wider conclusions about the reading of printed sermons in early modern England. Another interesting feature of this manuscript, by the way, is that the compiler has annotated a few passages with the comment excellent. The texts favoured with this note of approval include John King's sermons on Jonah, Thomas Morton's Catholic Appeal for Protestants, Henry Smith's sermons, and John Hayward's Sanctuary of the Troubled Soul. Not Donne, interestingly. Donne doesn't get the note excellent. In my experience, it's quite uncommon to find copies of printed sermons annotated with direct expressions of approval like this. So here again, Commonplace books offer us a potentially significant source of evidence for early modern reading practices. Another manuscript I'd like to instance here is Bodleian MS 5091. This was compiled by John Robartes, first Earl of Radnor, and is rather cursorily described in the old Harleian catalogue as a sort of commonplace book containing notes out of various authors, of which very few articles deserve particular notice. The contents are mainly legal and historical, but they also include Robartes' notes on Lancelot Andrewes' 96 sermons. I apologise for not having an image of this manuscript to show you, but as you'll no doubt be aware, the BL catalogue and collections have been unavailable for the past 6 weeks due to a ransomware attack, so you'll have to make do with a transcript. Here we find a similar pattern of reading, with Robartes pulling out short moral commonplaces marked by some particularly striking figure of speech. So, for example, from one of Andrewes' Lent sermons, he extracted a passage on the difference between love and lust. Love, the fruit of the spirit, not lust, the weed of the flesh. On the next page, the very next page, his eye was caught by another passage on the nature of love. The purse strings of love are made of a leek blade, easily in sunder and wide open without great ado. And then 10 pages further on, a passage punning on the difference between passion and compassion. Compassion is but passion at rebound. A sword pierced the Virgin Mary's soul. She had animam compatiensis, so he much more must be pierced who had animam patientis. Another interesting feature of these notes is that Robartes' copy of Andrewes' 96 sermons still survives in the library at Lanhydrock House in Cornwall, now the property of the National Trust. In his account of the library at Lanhydrock, Mark Purcell remarks that the first Earl's contribution to the library is decidedly difficult to quantify because he did not inscribe his books in any very formal or systematic way, and for the most part, we can only infer his ownership on the basis of occasional annotations in his characteristic gappy hand. But the reason why Robartes didn't inscribe or annotate his books very heavily is not that he didn't read them, but that he saved his notes for his commonplace book. So the printed book alone can tell us relatively little about his reading practices, but the printed book in conjunction with the commonplace book can tell us a great deal more. I hope that with the help of these examples, a particular mode of reading sermons has now started to come into focus for you, a distinctive method of reading that involves picking out brief passages from sermons and filing them away in commonplace books under particular subject headings. And by putting together enough examples of this practice, we can start to see patterns in the choice of authors and perhaps start to identify a sort of early modern pulpit hit parade. Who are the preachers who turn up most frequently in commonplace books? Well, they include Henry Smith, Thomas Adams, Thomas Playfair, Bishop John King, and Bishop Joseph Hall, all of whom were widely admired for their style. And what was so attractive about their style was precisely that it lent itself to this method of reading with short, snappy sound bites and vivid, memorable similes that could easily be cut and pasted into a commonplace book. Indeed, I would go further and suggest that these authors are consciously and deliberately writing in a style that lent itself to being easily commonplace. One more example taken from another manuscript in the Bodleian MS Eng misc D28. This manuscript, compiled by an Oxford academic in the 1620s, has been discussed in a 2007 article by Guillaume Courtelin, focusing on its inclusion of passages from Shakespeare and Johnson. And it's now become famous, at least in our little world of sermon studies, for one particular extract from Romeo and Juliet, which the compiler notes was quoted in 2 university sermons at Oxford in 1620 and 21, applying it to God's love to his saints, either hurt with sin or adversity, never forsaking them. So Romeo's words to Juliet become God's words to his saints. As Courtelin points out, this shows how the commonplace book created a space where the boundaries between sermons, poetry, and plays were porous, where textual material could pass between these different genres. But for the purpose of this paper, I want to focus on a different example from the same manuscript. Here are the extracts from John King's 1608 sermon on the gunpowder plot. And here are some of the passages that the compiler is pulling out relating to the evil deeds of the Jesuits and their co-conspirators. As the sea is ever working and boiling like a pot of ointment, so they, always hammering and forging some mischievous act. They bear not their bows and arrows as scarecrows in the garden of cucumbers, to fray, but to shoot, not at stakes, but men. They take the advantage of the dark, of privacy, of secrecy. They shoot privily. Plainness was a term with more than one meaning in early modern England, but when contemporaries talked about the plain style of preaching, this was part of what they meant. I want to make 2 points about this method of reading. The first is that it encourages radical decontextualization, taking short extracts from a sermon, lifting them completely out of context, shuffling them around, and inserting them into a totally different context. I've suggested that some preachers consciously designed their sermons to be read and extracted in this way. Yet at the same time, this is clearly very different, both from a linear method of reading in which you follow the sermon from beginning to end, just as you would when hearing it delivered from the pulpit, and also from the highly structured method of reading in which you visualize the whole sermon as a single unit. Take, for example, Thomas Jackson's 1609 sermon, The Convert's Happiness. The printed edition begins, as many printed sermons of this period do, with a folding table called Logical Analysis of the Text, in which the structure of the sermon is set out in diagrammatic form. And the purpose of this is to show how the doctrines and applications of the sermon flow logically from the biblical text. So the whole sermon becomes a single unit flowing out from the text. But when we turn to another commonplace book, Harley MS 6534, we find the sermon cut up and extracted in an entirely different form. It's not clear that the compiler of this commonplace book had any interest in the logical analysis of the sermon. What he took away from it were just a handful of brief extracts, completely divorced from their context. And one of these extracts, incidentally, is a good example of how material could travel from one sermon to another. Jackson has a passage on preaching as the true nobility, which, as he acknowledges in a marginal note, he took from George Meryton's Sermon of Nobility, printed in 1607. And this passage is then in turn copied from that marginal note into Harley MS 6534. 4 sorts of nobility: 1 natural, 2 fortunate, 3 moral, 4 divine, which is the excellentest of all. So that's my first point, radical decontextualization. And my second point is that this method of reading is practically universal. Here, for example, is the future Archbishop of Canterbury, William Sancroft, taking notes on Thomas Carew's certain godly and necessary sermons of 1603 in the commonplace book that's now Bodleian MS Sancroft 66. Sancroft undoubtedly had the training to analyze the sermon logically if he had wanted to, but instead he chose to extract a few colorful sayings and similes, just as in the other commonplace books we've been looking at. An ill officer, like an ape on the housetop, high-perched but ill-qualited, and so useth his exaltation only to the hurt of those under him. Interesting, by the way, that the copy of the printed edition, which I took from Ebo, is not Sancroft's copy. It's another copy, but has that passage underlined. So clearly somebody else was also noting that passage and perhaps putting it into a commonplace book. So we shouldn't think of this method of reading as in any way naive or simplistic, as though people are letting the meat of the sermon pass them by and just sort of cherry picking a few snippets. This is a highly purposeful and deliberate method of reading, and it seems to have been practiced very widely indeed. So, what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, my main aim in this paper is simply to draw attention to this body of material, which I think deserves more attention than it's received, as evidence of how sermons were read in the early modern period. I'd also like to put out an appeal to you for more examples of commonplace books with extracts from printed sermons. I'm sure there are many more, and I'm sure some of you will be able to draw my attention to examples that I've missed. It's often been argued that the early modern period saw a shift from intensive to extensive reading, that is, from the close reading of a small number of texts to the more cursory reading of a larger number of texts. As evidence of that shift, I think these commonplace books point both ways. On the one hand, they do suggest that readers were engaging with a much larger number of printed sermons and using them more selectively. To put it another way, the experience of reading a sermon on the printed page was moving further away from the experience of hearing a sermon preached. It was more about cutting and pasting than following the arguments through the sermon in a strictly linear fashion. But on the other hand, the cutting and pasting of sermons into commonplace books implies a form of reading that was by no means cursory or superficial. It implies rereading, it implies thoughtful recollection, and it implies memorization. As Elspeth Chedelska argues in her book Silent Reading and the Birth of the Narrator, the memories of the pious in this period seem to have been well stocked with appropriate expressions, to the point where it is difficult to draw a line between their own words and those remembered from sermons and books. But another question still remains. Consider some of the extracts we've encountered in this paper. The purse strings of love are made of a leek blade. They bear not their bows and arrows as scarecrows in the garden of cucumbers. Does this perhaps suggest that early modern readers were by and large not terribly interested in sermons for their doctrine and theology, that they were more interested in colourful similes about leeks and cucumbers? That is certainly one way we could interpret these commonplace books, but there is other evidence that suggests a more sustained engagement with doctrinal and theological issues. I talked earlier about the early modern hit parade, the preachers like Henry Smith, Thomas Adams, and Joseph Hall, whose sermons frequently show up in commonplace books. For the 1630s, one figure stands out above all, and that's the moderate Puritan preacher Richard Sibbes, lecturer at Gray's Inn in London and master of Catherine Hall in Cambridge. I found no less than 3 commonplace books here which Sibbes features heavily. When I say heavily, I mean he is the major author featured in these manuscripts. These are BL Ad MS 4101, BL Harley Manuscript 6534, and Folger the A4. The last of these being a volume entitled Certain Collections Taken Out of Dr. Sibbes's Sermons Preached by Him at Gray's Inn in London and elsewhere. I'm sorry that I don't have images of these 3 manuscripts to show you. Ad MS 4101 is particularly interesting because it's marked up with a series of marginal notes and symbols, including pointing hands and trefoils, that the compiler, Richard Wharf, seems to have used to indicate passages of special importance to him, and drawings of flaming hearts that he used to indicate key events in his life. Wharf was imprisoned in the Fleet Prison in London between 1644 and 1645, and appears to have had this manuscript with him in prison. So there's a lot of evidence that could potentially be gleaned from it about the use of sermons as devotional reading. What interests me most about this group of manuscripts, however, is what they tell us about the popularity of Sibbes's sermons. What we seem to have here is evidence of a culture of manuscript circulation in which Sibbes's sermons are being copied and passed around in Puritan circles in London. When I say copied, I mean partly copied from the printed editions, but also copied from one manuscript to another. Why were these sermons so especially popular? A number of the extracts copied in these manuscripts consist of short, pithy remarks with a kind of aphoristic or proverbial ring to them. The bitterest things in religion are sweet. Christianity is a busy trade. Sincerity is the perfection of a Christian. But others consist of longer sayings with an emphasis on self-examination and moral psychology, such as the examples I've given you here. That man hath made a good progress in religion, that hath a high esteem of the ordinances of God. And though perhaps he find himself dead and dull, yet the best things have left such a taste and relish in his soul that he cannot be long without them. This is a sign of a good temper. And then again, a man endued with common grace is rather a patient than an agent in conflict. Light troubles him against his will, but a godly man labors to help the light and to work his heart to an opposition against sin. He is an agent as well as a patient. We are here in the territory of classic Puritan practical divinity. And what we may be dealing with here is a kind of Puritan appropriation of the commonplace book tradition. In other words, the same method of commonplacing that I've been describing in this paper with a much stronger emphasis on the duties and particularly the psychology of the godly life. Many of the extracts deal with problems of religious doubt and melancholy and strategies for religious consolation. The method of reading is much the same, but it seems to me there's a religious mood in these commonplace books from the 1630s that one doesn't find in the commonplace books of 10 or 20 years earlier. It's the modulation of some commonplacing into a Puritan key, or you might say kind of shift from that kind of Elizabethan, plain moral sententiousness to something much more deeply concerned with comfort and consolation. One finds something similar in the genre of printed text that has long fascinated me, and that's the genre of broadsheet sayings from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in which short extracts from sermons or sayings of particular preachers are printed in a numbered list on a single sheet of paper, clearly designed to be pinned up on a wall. The best known example is Old Mr. Dodd's sayings, the collected wisdom of the Puritan minister John Dodd, who died in 1645. But there are many other examples of the genre, mostly relating to nonconformist clergy, such as the Presbyterian James Janeway and the Independent Thomas Goodwin. It's the fact that these sayings are printed in broadsheet format as a form of godly wall decoration that makes them so interesting. And there's an important story to be told here, I think, about the popularization of Puritan practical divinity through the culture of the commonplace book, a story that begins in the 1630s with manuscript circulation and ends up 50 years later with these printed broadsheets pinned up on the wall. That's a story for another occasion, but what I hope to have done in this paper is to have persuaded you that if we're interested in the reception history of early modern sermons, these commonplace books offer us an exceptionally rich source of evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnold. That was great. Yes, we have some rounds of applause here. Does anybody want to start us off with a question for Arnold? We've got lots of time. Oops, as I drop my papers.
I can finally see the list of attendees, which I couldn't see. I was a screen sharing, so it's nice to see so many familiar names and so many friends.
Okay, we can go to Andrew Foster, and then I have a question in the chat as well after that.
Thanks very much, Arnold, for that. My question is a bit more about the compilation of the commonplace books.
Yes.
Do we have much evidence that sometimes these might be kept by a family? In other words, they're not just single author, they are passed on through a family, and therefore people are adding in different sections in different hands. In your
Yes.
study of the commonplace book, is that the case?
Yes, I think I'd say the majority are a single authored manuscripts, but there are some examples. One of them I think it's the National Library of Scotland manuscript that I mentioned, is mainly in one hand, but there are certain passages in a different hand, as though the compiler is passing it over to someone else to copy. And then the other interesting one is the Richard Wharf manuscript that I mentioned at the end, which is clearly it's clearly passed down within a family, and there are further notes in a hand of about 30 or 40 years later. So these manuscripts clearly are being preserved, and they are clearly being passed around.
Many thanks.
All right. I have a question from Helen Kemp, which she put in the chat. I think she's in a place where she can't speak.
I can't see the chat.
Yes. I will read it to you. She says, "Thanks very much, Arnold. I really enjoyed your paper. We have a folio theological commonplace book in Thomas Plume's library.
Huh.
It doesn't say in the MS itself that the extracts were taken from printed sermons, but perhaps they were." And then she asks, "What would you recommend as the best method of finding out whether or not this is the case?"
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. People would pop up pointing out things I didn't know, and I only know of the Plume manuscripts from that article many years ago in the Essex Review by Andrew Clark, called Dr. Plume's Notebook. So I knew there were manuscripts in the Plume library, but I've never looked at them myself. On my to-do list. So maybe I can organise we can organise a research trip to the Plume Library. As for identifying where the extracts are coming from, well, all I can say really is that with the digitalization of so many printed texts, it's now become possible as never before, simply to Google search some keywords or a key phrase and have a reasonably good chance of identifying the source. And I have identified a good many anonymous manuscripts that way.
It looks like Mary has a question.
Hello, Mary.
Yes. Hello, thank you. That was brilliant. I'm just wondering about the kind of different uses of the text that's implied in the account you've given. The classic commonplace book and the Florilegia are being compiled with a view to reusing them as a writer.
Yes.
But the later manuscripts, particularly the kind of collections of comforts, as it were, is not a writerly reuse, but a devotional reuse. And I'm wondering if there's an argument. Is this to do with the greater availability of printed sermons, so that more people are buying them who aren't professional clerics or writers, and so the range of uses that the texts have has increased?
That's interesting. Yes. So there's a shift, you think, from a kind of writerly or preacherly use, where you're to a readerly or devotional use. That sounds pretty plausible to me. I am intrigued by the chronology of the the manuscripts I've been talking about, which really wasn't apparent to me until I started preparing for this paper and drawing up a list, and then it became quite noticeable that there was very little from before 1620, and then after 1620, this great the number of commonplace books with printed sermons really starts to take off. So I think it's a function of just that expansion of the printed sermon as a genre. The sense that a lot of there is material scattered in so many different sermons, and you want to bring it together in some way. I think also that remark by Francis Bacon, it's in the Advanced Fundamentals of Learning, where he says, if the non-controversial bits of English sermons were brought together, it would be the best work of divinity that were written since the Apostles' time, which is just another kind of readerly strategy, where Bacon seems to be expressing a kind of irritation with religious controversy and polemic. Let's just forget all that and go to the really good stuff, which is the exposition of the biblical texts. So that may be another reason for the compilation of these books, apart from the devotional motivation which you suggest, trying to bring together the material that was considered permanently worth keeping.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Well, people are thinking. I'm curious about, you were saying that you thought that some of the preachers were deliberately writing sermons in a way that would work for this type of reading practice. Can you say a little bit more about that? Do you think were they actively trying to encourage?
I'm quite sure about that, although I can't quite prove it. I think that a part of this goes along with the more general view I have, which is just that a sermon style is evolving and developing extremely quickly in this period, in a sense, just as the style of early modern drama is evolving very quickly. I have a comparison in my next book about the between sermons and drama, and suggesting that just as the kind of sort of thumping barnstorming style of plays like the Spanish tragedy seems rather sort of rather unsophisticated by about 1600. The same thing is happening with sermons, that this kind of very, very sort of morally sententious style that you find in Henry Smith, for example, where full of sort of proverbs and very colourful similes. This has great appeal to the late Elizabethan minds, and then by about 1620, more sophisticated preachers are trying to move away from it, and there is a much more sophisticated style which you can associate with Donne and Andrewes and people, which is not simply relying on that kind of very obvious moral commonplaces. I'm sorry, that's a rather roundabout way of answering your question. But it just seems to me that the style that you get in say Henry Smith or Thomas Adams or Thomas Playfair, it seems so clearly designed to be extracted, so clearly designed to be cut and pasted. It's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that readers are reading these sermons in this way, because I think the preachers designed them to be read in that way. Jean has a question. Shall I
yeah, sure.
Pick that up? Jean asking if I'd like to extrapolate to talk about commonplacing of printed sermons after 1650. I was afraid somebody would ask that, because really I know the material after 1650 much less well, although I have looked at some manuscripts of that date, and it's surprising to me how less. I'm tempted to say there was a kind of heyday of the commonplacing of printed sermons, and it's between about 1620 and 1650, and after that the practice goes into decline, or at least printed sermons get diluted into commonplace books, which cover a much wider range of material rather than being specifically religious or theological.
Oh, okay.
That's my impressionistic comment, which may be disproved by further examples.
Did you have any follow-up, Jean, or your?
Well, no, I mean, I was interested to see, the printed sermons proliferated after 1650, but I mean, it's a whole different. I was really impressed by your paper and by the way that you were talking about how the sermons were written to be commonplace. I mean, have I taken this the wrong way? Am I? That was okay.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, because. So you had an example from Donne sermons, right?
Yes.
And I just wondered whether or not you had any other information about Donne that might share with us.
What?
Any other example? Yeah.
Donne was deliberately designing his sermons to be commonplace. Well, wouldn't it be nice to find evidence of that?
I'm looking for that.
One example I can think of is there is a printed sermon from Donne's library, and I think it may actually be the 609 John King gunpowder plot sermon, which I mentioned in the paper, in which there was very rare annotations by Donne where he's written NB in the margin against a particular passage. So right. Donne was obviously, in the manuscript we'd all like to find is Donne's commonplace book, but even without the survival of Donne's commonplace book, it's clear he was very accustomed to this method of commonplacing, and that comes out in his sermons very clearly. So it doesn't seem surprising that he or other preachers should be designing the sermons to be commonplace.
Right. Okay.
I mean, as I was writing the paper, I felt two things. Two contradictory feelings as I was writing the paper. One, this is all obvious, and B, this is also interesting. In a sense, anyone who knows about the history of early modern commonplace books, this will all seem very, very familiar. But at the same time, I I'm not aware that anyone's really discussed it in detail and discussed what it can tell us about the way that people are actually reading printed sermons. And this is partly kind of making up for my own failure, because when I wrote The Art of Hearing, I had a chapter called From Manuscript to Print. And now I think I really ought to have had another chapter called From Print to Manuscript. That was an aspect of the early modern sermon that I failed to cover.
Well, and I just want to add, Arnold, that it is sort of revolutionary for you to be talking about sermons written as commonplace, for commonplacing, because we tend to read them as whole, right? And yes. I've spent a lifetime chastising people for not doing that, and all of a sudden, it's obvious even from the way people take sermon notes that that's not true, right? That they neither were composed that way nor were digested that way, right? I mean, that's a very modern way of reading.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I can see a question from Trevor in the chat. Shall I just answer? Shall I answer that?
Yes, if you covered it already, Arnold, my apologies. It started raining here and the broadband disappeared for a while.
I thought you'd disappeared, Trevor, but you're back. I see. So, does the selection into commonplace books correspond with the highlighting and marking in printed copies? Are the same items being noticed? I think yes, though I think one finds underlining in other people may have other experiences, but in my experience, one finds ink underlining in printed sermons quite commonly, but finding notes in copies of printed sermons is much more unusual. I found a few examples. There was one I wanted to show, which unfortunately is in the BL, so of course hasn't been accessible for the past 6 weeks. And there was also a volume of printed sermons sold at auction in the period sale about 10 years ago, which had notes clearly designed clearly by somebody who was marking passages for commonplacing. But alas, that volume was sold at auction, and I don't know where it is now. So again, I suppose I should put out an appeal. If any of you come across interestingly annotated copies of printed sermons, and particularly copies, with that little trefoil sign, that little flower symbol written in the margin, I'd be very interested to know.
We have a question from John Craig.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Arnold, vintage Arnold Hunt, and thank you very much for the paper. Am I coming through clearly?
You are, yes.
I'm not sure if this is really, I'm not sure if this is really turning into a question so much as really just a comment, and particularly with Trevor here and yourself, both of you know so much about William Dowsing. I've had occasion to look a little bit more closely over just the past couple of months at William Dowsing's copy. So William Dowsing, to the rest of the audience, this very interesting chap who's given a commission to remove monuments of idolatry from Suffolk and Cambridge churches, but a remarkable reader of texts and also an annotator of texts. But his copy of a commentary on the whole book of Judges over in Aberystwyth, it raises questions around how early modern readers are, in fact, what are they doing with whole volumes? So Rogers with these, I can't remember how many sermons, but it's a hefty tome that Dowsing goes through. And it's very interesting. As far as I know, I don't think Dowsing, maybe he did commonplace, but in that particular volume, he adds leaves, and he because there is no index, and so he's trying to actually find a way of making sense of this mass of exegetical and homiletical material that Rogers has produced. And in some ways, a number of the bigger texts that Dowsing annotates, whether it's Raleigh's History over at William and Mary College, or it'd be fascinating to see his Bible. I don't know where that is, but Rogers on Judges. He's trying, sometimes in the title page, sometimes by adding leaves, to, if you like, in a way, commonplace for himself, extracting things. And the thing that has struck me as well a little bit, I mean, he's fascinated with animals. I mean, so stories about dogs absolutely fascinate Dowsing. Stories about whales, stories about elephants. In the historical texts that he's reading, a lot of these are, English translations of Greek and Roman histories. Dogs really attract his attention in a big way. That's just kind of an opening, partly to thank you for a wonderful paper once again, Arnold, and whether or not, this stuff, because you know some of this material. I suppose maybe the question becomes, to what extent in the early 17th century, when you come across texts like those by Andrew Willett, where in other words, they're trying to produce, here's the best interpretations of these tricky passages from Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. So in other words, aids to biblical knowledge in which they're actually taking a bunch of different stories. It'd be kind of interesting to see how these, if you like, compilers of biblical exegetical texts, what draws their attention, the kinds of questions. So it'd be interesting in a way to see where Willett stands. I'm not sure Rogers is idiosyncratic, it seems to me. Anyway, that's a kind of opening for you.
Yes. And you've reminded me, John, that way back, you and I and Duncan Roberts were going to collaborate on an article about William Dowsing's annotations, and then, well, what happened? Lockdown happened, and getting into libraries proved difficult. But we need to revisit that. And as you mentioned, Willett, Dowsing's annotated copies of Willett do survive in Cambridge University Library. Though Willett is an interesting case, because a lot of what he's doing in those big biblical commentaries is actually translated directly from Latin commentaries by Protestant commentators on the continent. And he doesn't identify how much he's translating. So it's never clear with those books how much you're actually getting Willett and how much you're getting Willett translating somebody else.
It looks like Mary has another question.
I'm sorry, is that okay? Am I allowed another go?
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Just this conversation that I've got the you mentioned silent reading and the narrator. The quotation that's going through my head is from the Gutenberg Galaxy, and the anecdote about books as a technology for remembering, books as a technology for forgetting, and what the conversation here is about, I think, a little is manuscript books as a technology for remembering, when the printed book is so huge it's impossible it needs to be synthesized to make it memorable. But I'm wondering if there's another technology of remembering here, which is to do with the circulation of books and the permanent ownership of books. I've been kind of trying to do this with Donne, to think about where he got all of the books that he quotes, given how skint he was, and given that St. Paul's didn't have a decent library, Lincoln's Inn didn't have a theology library, and I think he was borrowing. And those commonplace books that Walton talks about must have been his way of keeping the florilegia, the quotations that he wanted, after he had to give the book back. So are there different reasons for keeping commonplace books? Or we've already discussed several. There's writing, there's devotional, there's synthesizing. Is there also kind of keeping a copy of a bit of a book when you don't actually own the whole thing. There seems to be a lot of parts to a lot of different practices here.
Yeah, yes, well, you're right. I suppose there are two strategies for keeping a commonplace book. You know, one is to copy all the stuff you want into the commonplace book, so you can then safely discard the printed books that you got it from, or as you say, return them to their original owners. Or the other is to treat the commonplace book as an index. And use it as a kind of sort of catalogue and finding aid, which you do find interestingly in that National Library of Scotland manuscript that I mentioned. The compiler of that includes page numbers, and often rather than copying the whole thing out in full, he'll say, you know, see page 320, excellent. You know, so obviously he's assuming that, you know, that he will go from the commonplace book back to the printed to the printed sermon, and does say at several points, actual references to help him identify the physical volume on the shelf. He says bound in vellum. So you know, it's a kind of aid memoir to help him pull the book off the shelf.
Are there other questions? I saw a hand up briefly, but I don't know that was an error or not. Maybe, well, I've seen lots of annotated copies, but they're from the 18th century, so it's probably too, like, annotations, maybe not lots. I've seen at least a dozen or more from the 18th century, but that's probably too late for you for printed sermons.
I mean, the list that I drew up that I put on the PowerPoint, I think it has 12 or 13 entries on it, which is not much really. I'm convinced there must be a lot more out there, which I've just failed to find. And I suspect the reason for that is just that it's just shown that as I said, it's just these manuscripts just appear in the catalogues as religious notebook, a theological commonplace book. So unless you're actually looking, then you won't find them. So I am convinced there is a lot more material still out there.
I'm curious too, you mentioned I can't remember which one, but one of the commonplace books, there was a few excellent remarks. Was that the sole example of that, or were there other ones that actually provided some sort of comments
that's the only
comments? That's the only one.
That's the only example I found. Actually, that goes back to Mary's question about, you know, are these preacherly compilations, or are they readerly compilations? I think that one is a preacherly compilation, and when he says excellent, it's a way of highlighting the fact that it's something he may want to use in the sermon.
Right. Are there other questions for Arnold? I know you had mentioned when we were talking about your focus for this lecture that you'd also looked at examples of printed commonplace books that draw from printed sermons. I'm not sure if you want to say anything about that.
Just that as I said at the beginning, you know, it's a kind of two-way traffic. This material is going backwards and forwards between print and manuscript. So it's not so. So as well as looking at the way that printed sermons get extracted in manuscripts, I think it's also important to look at the way that those manuscripts, commonplace books, then get put into print. I gave one example, which is the Robert Corddry's collection of similes, and I suspect if I could be bothered to do some proper searching on that, I might be able to identify the sources that he was using in other printed sermons. And then the classic example from later in the 17th century, which Giles will know all about, is John Spencer's collection called Things New and Old, which Spencer compiled in his capacity as librarian of Zion College, therefore having access to an excellent library of printed sermons. And this is designed as, I don't know, partly an anthology of the best bits of printed sermons, also as a kind of quarry for other preachers to use. And if I'd had more time, I would like to have talked about that a bit more.
That's great, thanks. And of course, there are different ways. Go ahead.
The paper took on a very different form from how I'd originally planned it when I first agreed to give it, because I'd assumed that most of the examples I'd be using would be from the BL. And of course, when I started writing this paper, I then realised that I wouldn't have access to any of the BL manuscripts. So that forced me to look beyond the BL and pick out some examples in other libraries.
Well, and you did find some very interesting ones, so maybe it's not a bad thing. And then later on, you can go back to the BL and expand it more that way. Are there more questions? Well, thank you very much, Arnold. That was really fascinating and useful for thinking about the ways that reading practices have evolved. Before everyone disappears, I want to bring your attention to the fact that GEMMS is going to be having a conference next year called Preachers, Hearers, Readers, and Scribes, New Approaches to Early Modern Sermons in Manuscript. We've put out a call for papers and abstracts are due in 3 weeks' time. We are looking for, papers that relate to the type of manuscripts in GEMMS, which include things like commonplace books and reports of sermons, as well as sermon notes, full manuscripts, transcriptions, basically all kinds of manuscript materials related to sermons. And we are welcoming a whole variety of approaches, things that more, including things like perspectives from the digital humanities, people who might be working in libraries archives, like Helen has sent us one, and also both from preachers on both sides of the Atlantic, though I imagine most of you are focused on the UK here today. And the abstracts, and I didn't say when it was or where. This will be held next October, the 3rd to 5th of October, 2024, in Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. So it will be primarily at Harvard Divinity School, with also some events going on at the Congregational Library in Boston, who we're collaborating on this with. So you can find the information about the call for papers on any of GEMMS' social media pages. The full thing is published on the blog, and I'm going to be doing some more posts about that today. So thank you very much for coming. This has been a great lecture series. We've, including, Mary started us off and Arnold is finishing this, and it's been great to hear about a whole variety of perspectives on early modern manuscript sermons, both from more established scholars and some of our early career researchers who've been working with us on GEMMS. So thank you very much. And this was a great conclusion to our series. And do think about submitting abstracts for the conference. Jean, do you want to say anything? No?
I don't need to say anything. Everything is, we're hoping that people will come to Boston, and we're looking forward to an in-person gathering of transatlantic sermon scholars. But we'll have more information as we develop our plan. Yeah.
Yeah. And there may be some sort of virtual options available to you for people
That's
who
right.
can't.
That's right.
Can't make it to Boston. But we hope you can. It should be great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.